We'd been planning the trip for months, 6 of us from Montreal, looking to escape the city chaos and ring in the new year somewhere quiet. My friend Thomas had found the cabin through some obscure rental website, a place deep in the Laurentians that promised complete isolation and rustic charm. The photos showed a traditional Quebec log cabin with a stone chimney, surrounded by forest and mountains. It looked perfect. We left Montreal on the afternoon of December 31st, 3 cars caravanning north on the 15, then onto smaller highways, then county roads, until finally we turned onto what was barely more than a trail through the forest. The listing had warned us the access road wasn't maintained in winter, but we hadn't realized just how bad it would be. The logging road was buried under 2 weeks of unplowed snow, barely visible between the trees. We made it maybe half a kilometer before we had to abandon the cars and continue on foot. Thomas had brought a sled for hauling supplies, and we loaded it with our bags, food, and enough firewood to supplement whatever we found at the cabin. The hike took nearly an hour through knee-deep snow, following what we hoped was the road, using Thomas's GPS to guide us. The cabin appeared suddenly through the trees, exactly as advertised. It was larger than I'd expected, maybe 40 feet long, built from massive logs that had darkened with age. Smoke rose from the stone chimney Thomas had arranged for the caretaker to start a fire that morning, so the place wouldn't be frozen when we arrived. We hauled our supplies inside and spent the next few hours settling in. The cabin was one large room with a sleeping loft accessible by a ladder, furnished simply with a wood stove, a rough table, some chairs, and sleeping bags already laid out on the loft floor. There was no electricity, no running water, just oil lamps for light, and a hand pump outside for water that we'd have to melt snow for since the pump was frozen solid. It was exactly what we'd wanted. Isolation, simplicity, a chance to disconnect from everything and just enjoy being together in the wilderness. We spent the afternoon splitting wood and exploring the immediate area around the cabin. The forest was dense with pine and birch, the snow pristine and unmarked except for animal tracks. The nearest neighbor, according to Thomas, was at least 5 kilometers away. We were truly alone out here. As evening fell, we lit the oil lamps and cooked dinner on the wood stove, a simple meal of pasta and canned sauce. But it tasted incredible in that rustic setting. We drank wine from bottles we'd carried in, told stories, played cards by lamplight. It felt timeless, like we'd stepped back 100 years to a simpler way of life. Around 11:30, someone suggested we go outside to watch for fireworks from Mont Tremblant. The resort town was maybe 20 kilometers away, as the crow flies, and we thought we might be able to see the midnight display from our vantage point in the mountains. We bundled up in our winter gear and stepped out into the night. The temperature had dropped to at least -20, and our breath turned to ice crystals in the air. The sky was brilliantly clear, stars visible in impossible numbers without any light pollution. We could see our breath in the starlight. We stood in a loose circle in the clearing in front of the cabin, stamping our feet to stay warm, checking our phones for the time. 11:55, 5 minutes to midnight. That's when we heard it. Singing, a voice, male and distant, singing Auld Lang Syne in French. Ce n'est qu'une au revoir. The voice was coming from somewhere in the woods behind the cabin, maybe 100 meters away. "There are neighbors," said Marie, sounding relieved. "Thomas, I thought you said we were alone out here." Thomas looked confused. "We should be. The nearest cabin is kilometers away. Maybe someone else had the same idea as us," I suggested. "Came out to the woods for New Year's." "Should we invite them over?" asked Jean-Paul. "We have wine." Thomas cupped his hands around his mouth and shouted toward the woods in French, "Hello, Happy New Year, join us." The singing stopped immediately. We stood there in the silence, waiting. The forest was completely still, no wind, no sounds except our own breathing. "Maybe they didn't hear us," Marie said. "They heard us," said Thomas quietly. Something in his voice made me uneasy. Then we heard footsteps, not walking toward us, walking around us, circling the cabin. Slow, deliberate steps crunching through the snow, moving from behind the cabin toward the side, then around to the front. "Hello?" Jean-Paul called out. "Who's there?" The footsteps continued, maintaining their steady pace. Whoever it was, they were walking a wide circle around the cabin, staying just at the edge of the clearing where the trees began. "This isn't funny," Marie said, her voice rising. "Who is that?" I pulled out my phone and turned on the flashlight. shining it toward where the footsteps seemed to be coming from. The beam illuminated snow and trees, but nothing else. Yet the footsteps continued, now moving behind the cabin again. "Inside," Thomas said firmly. "Everyone inside, now." We didn't argue. We moved quickly to the cabin door, stumbling in our haste, and Thomas locked it behind us with the heavy wooden bar. We stood in the lamplight, breathing hard, listening. The footsteps continued outside, around and around the cabin, regular as a clock. Crunch, crunch, crunch. The same steady rhythm, never stopping, never varying. "What the hell is this?" Jean-Paul demanded. "I don't know," Thomas said. He went to one of the small windows and peered out, but the darkness outside was absolute. "I can't see anything." We listened to the footsteps for what felt like forever. 10 minutes, 20, the same circle, over and over. Whoever or whatever was out there showed no signs of tiring or stopping. At midnight, we heard distant booms from the direction of Mont Tremblant, the New Year's fireworks. We'd come outside to watch them, and now we were trapped in this cabin, listening to someone or something walk circles around us in the snow. "Happy New Year," Marie said weakly, and a couple people laughed, but it sounded forced and frightened. The footsteps continued. Around 1 in the morning, they stopped. Just ceased, mid-step, leaving us in total silence. We waited, barely breathing, listening for any sound. Then came 3 knocks on the door. Slow, deliberate, impossibly loud in the quiet. Knock, knock, knock. We stared at the door, no one moving, no one speaking. The knocks came again. Same rhythm, same force. "Who's there?" Thomas called out, his voice cracking. No answer, just silence. Jean-Paul grabbed an oil lamp and moved toward the door. "I'm going to look out the window, see who it is." "Don't," I said. I don't know why I said it, instinct maybe, fear. But Jean-Paul was already at the window, holding the lamp up to see better. He looked out for a long moment, then backed away slowly. "What?" Marie demanded. "What did you see?" "Nothing," Jean-Paul whispered. "There's nothing there. No one's at the door." "But we heard the knocks." "I know what we heard," Jean-Paul snapped. "But there's no one there." We waited for more knocks, but they didn't come. Instead, the footsteps resumed, around and around the cabin. The same steady rhythm, the same circle. None of us slept that night. We kept the fire burning high, all the oil lamps lit, and we sat together in the center of the cabin, listening to those footsteps circle endlessly through the snow. They didn't stop until dawn broke, the gray light filtering through the small windows, revealing the forest outside in its winter silence. When the footsteps finally ceased with the sunrise, we waited another hour before anyone dared to open the door. Thomas and I went out together, both of us holding axes we'd found by the woodpile. The sight that greeted us was worse than I'd imagined. There were footprints in the snow, dozens of them, hundreds, all circling the cabin in a perfect ring, maybe 20 feet from the walls. The prints were clearly human boot prints, adult-sized, deep in the snow, but they formed only that circle. There were no tracks leading to the circle from the forest, no tracks leading away, just that endless ring of footprints, as if someone had materialized at that precise distance from the cabin and walked in circles all night before vanishing with the sunrise. "We're leaving," Thomas said, "right now." We didn't even pack properly. We just grabbed our essential belongings, left everything else, and started the long hike back to our cars. No one spoke during the walk. We were too scared, too confused, too desperate to get back to civilization. When we reached the cars, we didn't even try to turn around on the narrow logging road. We just backed down it, one after another, for nearly a kilometer, until we reached a wide enough spot to maneuver. I've thought about that night countless times in the years since. I've tried to come up with rational explanations. Someone playing a prank. Some local who knew the cabin would be rented and decided to scare the city people. But the footprints don't make sense. You can't walk circles in the snow for hours and leave no tracks showing how you arrived or departed. And the singing, "Ce n'est qu'un au revoir." It's only goodbye. See you again. That's what the song means. Sometimes I wonder if whoever was circling our cabin that night is still out there in the Laurentians, still walking their endless circle around that isolated cabin, still singing songs in French to whoever is foolish enough to rent the place for New Year's Eve, still waiting for someone to open the door after those 3 slow knocks. I've never been back to the Laurentians. I don't think I ever will, because some part of me is terrified that if I did return, if I found that cabin again, I'd see fresh footprints in the snow, a perfect circle around the abandoned building, as if whatever was out there is patient, as if it's still waiting, still walking, still singing. Ce n'est qu'un au revoir. It's only goodbye. We'll meet again. And I pray to God we never do. I was 19 and in my first year at Dalhousie when I came home to Moncton for the winter break. My parents still lived in the same house I'd grown up in, on a quiet street in the East End, and I'd been looking forward to a few weeks of doing nothing, sleeping in, eating home-cooked meals, seeing old friends. My friend Kyle texted me on the afternoon of New Year's Eve. Party tonight, North End. You should come. He sent an address I didn't recognize, somewhere off Main Street in a neighborhood I'd never had much reason to visit. The North End had a reputation, older houses, rougher streets, the kind of area where people kept to themselves. I asked him whose party it was. He didn't respond right away, and when he did, his message was brief. Friend of a friend, should be good. That was enough for me. I was bored, restless, and a party sounded better than sitting at home watching the countdown on TV with my parents. I left around 9:30, telling my parents I was meeting up with friends. The drive took maybe 15 minutes, taking me across the Petit Kodiak River and into the North End. The streets were quiet, most people already at parties or staying home. The address Kyle had given me led me to a residential street lined with old houses, most of them showing their age, peeling paint, sagging porches, yards full of snow that hadn't been shoveled in weeks. The house was impossible to miss. It was a Victorian-style building, 3 stories tall, with a turret on one corner and ornate woodwork that had once been beautiful, but was now cracked and faded. The paint was peeling in long strips, and several of the windows on the upper floors were dark, but I could see lights on the main floor and hear music thumping from inside. There were no cars parked outside, which struck me as odd for a party, but I figured maybe people had parked on other streets or gotten rides. I knocked on the front door and waited. The music continued, and I could hear voices and laughter inside, but no one came to answer. I knocked again, harder this time. Still nothing. I tried the doorknob. It turned easily, unlocked. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The heat hit me immediately, a blast of warm air that smelled like beer and cigarettes, and too many bodies in too small a space. The hallway was narrow and dim, wallpapered with a pattern that looked decades old. To my left was a living room packed with people, maybe 30 of them, dancing and drinking and talking in small groups. The furniture had been pushed against the walls to create space, and someone had set up speakers in the corner that were playing music loud enough to make the floorboards vibrate. I stood in the doorway for a moment, scanning the crowd for Kyle or anyone else I might recognize. I didn't see him. In fact, I didn't recognize anyone. That wasn't unusual. Moncton wasn't that big, but I'd been away at school and didn't know everyone Kyle had become friends with. I walked into the living room, edging around the dancers, looking for the kitchen or wherever the drinks were. Nobody looked at me, not a glance, not a nod of acknowledgement. I was used to the usual party dynamic: eye contact with strangers, brief smiles, the casual, "Hey, you give people when you're sharing space." But these people acted like I wasn't there. I moved through the crowd, trying to make my way deeper into the house. I passed a group of guys standing near the speakers, beers in hand, laughing at something I couldn't hear over the music. I said, "Excuse me," as I squeezed past them. They didn't move, didn't acknowledge me at all. I had to physically push through, and even then, they didn't react, just continued their conversation like I hadn't touched them. The kitchen was through an archway at the back of the living room. It was less crowded but still occupied by several people leaning against counters and sitting at a small table. The linoleum floor was old and cracked, and the appliances looked like they were from the 70s. On the counter was an assortment of liquor bottles and beer cans, some opened, some not. I grabbed a beer from an open case and cracked it open. I turned to the guy standing next to me, early 20s, wearing a flannel shirt and jeans, and asked, "Whose party is this?" He didn't respond, didn't even look at me. He was staring at the wall, drink in hand, completely motionless. I tried again. "Hey man, do you know Kyle?" He invited me. Nothing. He might as well have been a statue. I felt a prickle of unease run down my spine. I moved to the table where 2 girls were sitting, both of them with their heads down, whispering to each other. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but they seemed engaged in conversation. "Excuse me," I said, a little louder than necessary. "Can you tell me where the host is?" Neither of them looked up. Neither of them acknowledged me at all. They just kept whispering, their voices too low for me to make out any words. I backed away from the table and returned to the living room. The party was still going, people dancing, people talking, the music pounding through the speakers. But now that I was paying attention, I noticed things that didn't add up. The conversations had no energy, no life. People's mouths moved, but I couldn't hear any actual words beneath the music. The dancers moved in strange, jerky rhythms that didn't quite match the beat. And no one, absolutely no one looked at me. I tried several more times to interact with people. I tapped a girl on the shoulder as she walked past. She didn't react, just continued walking like I hadn't touched her. I stood directly in front of a guy blocking a doorway and said, "Can I get through?" He stared straight ahead, right through me, unblinking. The unease was building into something closer to fear. This wasn't just people ignoring me. This was something else, something wrong. I decided to leave. I'd been there maybe an hour, and every minute was becoming more uncomfortable. I made my way back to the front door, pushing through the crowd of dancers who parted and closed around me like water, never acknowledging my presence. As I reached for the doorknob, I glanced back one more time. The party continued exactly as it had been. 30 people in a room, dancing and drinking and going through the motions of celebration. But there was no joy in it, no connection. Just bodies moving mechanically, faces blank and expressionless. I stepped outside and pulled the door shut behind me. The cold night air was a relief after the stifling heat inside. I got in my car and sat there for a moment, trying to process what had just happened. A party where no one acknowledged me, where everyone acted like I was invisible. It didn't make sense. I drove home feeling shaken and confused. When I got there, my parents were already in bed. I went to my room and tried to sleep, but I couldn't shake the memory of those blank faces, those jerky movements, the way everyone had looked through me like I wasn't there. The next morning, New Year's Day, I texted Kyle. "That party was weird, man. Where were you?" His response came quickly. "What party?" "The one you invited me to, last night, in the North End." There was a long pause before his next message appeared. "Dude, I didn't invite you to any party. I was homesick all night, food poisoning." I stared at my phone, reading his message over and over. "You texted me an address, said it was a friend of a friend's party." "I didn't text you yesterday. Check your messages." I did. I scrolled through our conversation history. The last message from Kyle was from 3 days earlier, wishing me happy holidays. There was no text from yesterday, no address, no invitation, but I'd seen it. I'd read the message, copied the address, driven there. I hadn't imagined it. I called him instead of texting. "Kyle, I'm not crazy. You sent me an address. I went to the party." "I'm telling you, I didn't. I was puking my guts out all night. I couldn't have gone to a party, even if I'd wanted to." He paused. "What address did you go to?" I gave him the street name and number. He was quiet for a long time. "You okay?" I asked. "That house has been empty for years," he said finally. "My cousin used to live on that street, the Victorian place, right? With the turret? It's been abandoned since we were kids." "That's impossible. I was inside it. There were people there. Music, drinks. It was a full party." "I'm telling you, that house is empty, boarded up. The city's been trying to decide whether to demolish it or declare it heritage. But nobody's lived there in at least 5 years." I felt sick. "I'm going back there, right now, in daylight. I'll prove it to you." I drove back to the North End, retracing my route from the night before. The streets looked different in daylight, less ominous, more ordinary. Just an old neighborhood with old houses, nothing sinister about it. I found the street easily enough. And there, in the middle of the block, was the Victorian house. It was abandoned. The windows were boarded up with plywood, some of it new, some of it weathered and old. The front porch was sagging dangerously, with yellow caution tape wrapped around the railings. The paint that had been peeling the night before was peeling still, but in the daylight I could see how badly deteriorated the whole structure was. This wasn't a house that had been occupied recently. This was a house that had been slowly falling apart for years. I got out of my car and walked up to the front door. It was chained shut from the outside, a heavy padlock securing it. I looked through a gap in one of the boarded windows. Inside was darkness and debris collapsed, plaster, broken furniture, the kind of destruction you see in places that have been left to rot. I walked around to the side of the house. More boarded windows, more deterioration, no signs of life, no signs that anyone had been here in years. I knocked on doors of the neighboring houses until an older woman answered. I asked her about the Victorian house. That place? She shook her head. Been empty since I moved here, and that was 2015. Some family used to own it, but they moved away or died or something. City keeps saying they're going to do something with it, but nothing ever happens. Why? You thinking of buying it? No, I thought I saw people there last night. She gave me a strange look. Nobody's been in that house for years. Kids used to break in sometimes, but the city sealed it up good after someone fell through the floor. You must have been seeing things. I thanked her and went back to my car. I sat there staring at the house, trying to reconcile what I'd experienced the night before with what I was seeing now. I'd been inside, I'd walked through those rooms. I'd seen people, heard music, felt the heat, but the house was abandoned, had been for years. I drove home in a daze. I didn't tell my parents what had happened. I didn't tell anyone except Kyle, and even then I could tell he didn't really believe me. He thought I'd gotten the address wrong, gone to a different house, confused about which one it had been. But I know what I saw. I know where I was. I have perfect recall of walking through that front door, of standing in that living room, surrounded by people who couldn't see me, of feeling increasingly terrified as I realized something was fundamentally wrong. Sometimes I think about those people, about who they were, about why they were there, in that abandoned house, having a party that no one living could see. Were they ghosts, trapped in some loop, eternally celebrating a New Year's Eve that never ends? Were they echoes of past parties, residual energy somehow playing out again and again? Or was I the ghost? Was I somehow seeing into the past, walking among people who had been real once but were long gone? I don't have answers. All I know is that on New Year's Eve, I went to a party in an abandoned house, and for an hour I existed in a space between what's real and what shouldn't be possible. And sometimes, late at night, I wonder if I ever really left. If maybe I'm still there, invisible and unacknowledged, wandering through rooms full of people who will never see me, trapped in a house that exists somewhere between memory and nightmare. My roommate Jared and I decided to stay in for New Year's Eve. We were both broke after the holidays, and the idea of fighting crowds at overpriced bars held no appeal. Our apartment in Regina was small but comfortable, a third-floor unit in an older building near the university. We'd stocked up on cheap champagne and frozen pizza, planning to watch the countdown on TV and call it a night. The building was quiet that evening. Most of our neighbors had gone out or were visiting family. The hallways were empty, the parking lot half vacant. We'd lived there for 6 months and barely knew anyone in the building, except for casual nods in the elevator. It was that kind of place, transient, impersonal, people keeping to themselves. We settled on the couch around 11, the TV tuned to the New Year's countdown from Toronto. Jared had cracked open the first bottle of champagne, and we were drinking it straight from the bottle, passing it back and forth. The apartment was warm, the radiators clanking and hissing as they worked overtime against the frigid prairie winter outside. At 11:58, someone knocked on our door. It was a firm knock, deliberate, 3 raps that echoed in our small living room. Jared and I looked at each other, confused. We weren't expecting anyone. Our friends were all at parties across town, and we hadn't ordered food. "You expecting someone?" I asked. "No. You?" I shook my head and got up from the couch. Through the peephole, I could see our neighbor from across the hall, Mrs. Chen, an older woman who we'd occasionally seen in the laundry room. She was maybe in her 70s, always polite, always keeping to herself. She'd lived in the building much longer than us, one of the few long-term residents. I opened the door. She was standing there in her nightgown, a thin cotton thing that looked completely inadequate for the heating in the building, let alone the -30 weather outside. Her gray hair was loose around her shoulders, and her feet were bare on the hallway carpet. But what struck me most was her expression. She looked confused and frightened, her eyes wide and her hands trembling. "Mrs. Chen, are you okay?" She looked at me like she was trying to remember who I was. Then she spoke, her voice hoarse and quiet. "Do you hear them counting?" I glanced back at Jared, who had come to stand behind me. "Who's counting?" She pointed down the hallway, toward the stairwell at the far end. "Listen, please, just listen." I stepped out into the hallway, and Jared followed. The corridor was dimly lit, the fluorescent lights humming overhead. Mrs. Chen stood beside us, still pointing toward the stairwell. And then I heard it. Voices. Dozens of them, maybe more. All counting in perfect unison. The sound was muffled, distant, but unmistakable. 10, 9, 8. The voices were coming from below us. From somewhere deep in the building, the basement maybe, or even deeper. But there was no party in the basement. The building didn't even allow gatherings down there. It was just storage lockers and the furnace room. 7, 6, 5. Mrs. Chen grabbed my arm, her fingers surprisingly strong. They count down every year, she whispered urgently. But they never reach 0. I stared at her, trying to make sense of what she was saying. What do you mean? Who are they? 4, 3, 2. The voices were getting louder now, echoing through the building's infrastructure. I could feel the vibration of them through the floor beneath my feet. 1. And then silence. Complete, absolute silence. The kind of silence that feels wrong, that makes your ears ring with the absence of sound. The humming of the fluorescent lights was gone. The clanking of the radiators had stopped. Even the distant traffic noise from outside had vanished. I turned to look at Jared. His face was pale in the hallway light, his mouth open as if he was about to say something. Then the lights went out. Not just the hallway lights. Everything. The lights in our apartment behind us, the exit signs at either end of the hallway, the glow from under other apartment doors. Total darkness, so complete I couldn't see my own hand in front of my face. Mrs. Chen's grip on my arm tightened. I could hear her breathing, rapid and shallow, right beside me. I could hear Jared shuffling his feet, making small sounds of confusion and fear. But beyond that, nothing. The building was utterly, impossibly silent. I don't know how long we stood there in the darkness. It felt like minutes, but was probably only 30 seconds. And then, as suddenly as they'd gone out, the lights came back on. I blinked against the sudden brightness, my eyes adjusting. The fluorescent lights buzzed and flickered overhead. The radiators resumed their clanking. I could hear the TV in our apartment, the announcer's voice excited as midnight approached. I looked to where Mrs. Chen had been standing. She was gone. Where did she go? Jared asked, his voice tight. We looked down the hallway in both directions. Empty. The door to her apartment across from ours was closed. I walked over and knocked. No answer. I tried the doorknob. Locked. Maybe she went back inside when the lights went out, Jared suggested, though he didn't sound convinced. We went back to our apartment, both of us shaken. The champagne sat forgotten on the coffee table. On TV, the countdown was continuing, people in Toronto cheering, the numbers ticking down to midnight. We'd somehow lost track of time in those 30 seconds of darkness. I couldn't shake the memory of Mrs. Chen's face, the fear in her eyes, the strength of her grip on my arm, or the sound of those voices, counting down in unison from somewhere deep beneath the building. The next morning, I knocked on Mrs. Chen's door. I wanted to check on her, make sure she was okay. No one answered. I knocked several more times over the next few days. Still no answer. Finally, I ran into the building manager in the lobby and asked about her. He gave me a strange look. Mrs. Chen? Apartment 307? Yeah, I haven't seen her since New Year's Eve. Is she okay? Mrs. Chen moved out in September, he said. Went to live with her daughter in Vancouver. The apartment's been empty since then. I've got a new tenant moving in next week. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. That's impossible. I saw her on New Year's Eve. She was standing in the hallway outside her apartment. He shook his head. You must be thinking of someone else. Mrs. Chen's been gone for months. I went back upstairs and stood in front of apartment 307. I pressed my ear to the door, listening. Nothing. I could see through the gap under the door. The apartment was dark, empty. But I'd seen her. I'd talked to her. She'd grabbed my arm, pointed down the hall, told me about the voices counting down. Jared had seen her too. I wasn't imagining it. I asked Jared about it when he got home from work that evening. You remember Mrs. Chen, right? The woman who knocked on our door on New Year's Eve? He was quiet for a long moment. I remember someone knocking, and you went to answer the door, but I don't remember seeing anyone. I thought maybe you were talking to someone down the hall, but when you came back, you looked freaked out. You don't remember the old woman, the nightgown, the counting voices? He shook his head slowly. I remember you going into the hallway. I remember the lights going out, but I don't remember anyone else being there. I didn't push it, but I knew what I'd experienced. I'd seen Mrs. Chen as clearly as I was seeing Jared now. I'd felt her hand on my arm. I'd heard her voice. Over the next few weeks, I tried to find out more about the building's history. It was old, built in the 1950s, but I couldn't find anything remarkable about it. No tragic deaths, no mysterious disappearances. Just a standard apartment building that had housed thousands of people over the decades. But I kept thinking about what Mrs. Chen had said. They count down every year, but they never reach zero. Who were they? What happens if they ever do reach zero? New Year's Eve came around again. Jared had moved out by then, new job in Calgary, and I had a different roommate, a quiet engineering student named Dev who kept to himself. I didn't tell him what had happened the previous year. I didn't want him to think I was crazy. As midnight approached, I felt the anxiety building. At 11:55, I told Dev I was going out to meet some friends. He barely looked up from his phone. I left the apartment and went down to my car in the parking lot. I sat there with the engine running, the heater blasting, watching the building. At 11:58, I saw the lights flicker. At 11:59, they went out completely, the entire building going dark against the night sky. I sat there in my car, watching, waiting. The building stayed dark for maybe 30 seconds, maybe a minute. Then the lights came back on, and everything returned to normal. I drove around for an hour before going back inside. Dev was asleep. Everything was fine. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had happened in those 30 seconds of darkness. Something I'd narrowly avoided by not being there. I moved out of that building 6 months later. I told myself it was because I'd found a better apartment closer to work. But the truth was, I couldn't stand being there anymore, especially as New Year's approached again. I still think about Mrs. Chen, about her frightened face, her urgent grip on my arm, about the voices counting down from somewhere deep beneath the building. I've tried to find her, to see if she really did move to Vancouver, if she's living with her daughter, but I haven't had any luck. It's like she vanished that New Year's Eve, disappearing when the lights went out. And I think about what she said. They count down every year, but they never reach zero. Every year, somewhere in that building, at 11:58 p.m. on New Year's Eve, voices start counting down. They get to 1, and then silence. Complete darkness. 30 seconds of nothing. But what happens if they count down to 0? What happens if, someday, they finish the countdown? I don't know, and I never want to find out. Because every New Year's Eve since then, no matter where I am, I make sure I'm not in that building. I'm not even in Regina if I can help it. I go somewhere else, somewhere far away, somewhere I can be certain I won't hear those voices counting down from the darkness beneath the earth. And at 11:58, wherever I am, I hold my breath and wait for midnight to pass. I wait for the new year to arrive safely, without incident, without that terrible silence and darkness. Because I'm terrified of the year when the countdown reaches 0, when whatever is beneath that building, whatever has been counting down year after year, finally completes its purpose. I'm terrified of what will emerge when that happens, what will come up from the darkness, released by the completion of a countdown that has been building towards something for longer than any of us can imagine. Mrs. Chen knew. That's why she looked so frightened. That's why she tried to warn me. And now I know too. And all I can do is run. Run from Regina, run from that building, run from whatever is counting down in the darkness below. Because they never reach 0. Not yet. But someday they will. And I pray I'm nowhere near that building when it happens. I was driving from Winnipeg to Brandon on New Year's Eve, 2002, heading to my parents' house to ring in the new year with family. I'd left later than I'd planned, finishing up some last-minute work at the office, and it was already past 11 by the time I merged onto the Trans-Canada Highway heading west. The road stretched out ahead of me, straight and flat, disappearing into the darkness of the Manitoba prairie. It was bitterly cold that night, the kind of cold that settles into your bones. The dashboard thermometer read -22 Celsius, and every time the wind gusted, it felt like it was trying to push my car off the road. Traffic was sparse, just me, and the occasional transport truck blowing past, its headlights briefly illuminating the snow-covered fields before fading back into darkness. I had the radio on, some classic rock station playing end-of-year retrospectives, and I was making good time. Brandon was about 2 hours from Winnipeg on a normal day, and I figured I could make it by 12:30 or 1 a.m. if I kept a steady pace. My parents would understand. They knew I'd been working long hours trying to close deals before the holidays. Around 11:30, about halfway to Brandon, I saw her. She was standing on the shoulder of the highway, right at the edge where the pavement met the snow-covered ditch. At first, I thought I was seeing things a trick of the headlights, maybe a road sign or a piece of debris. But as I got closer, I realized it was a person. A woman, standing perfectly still, her arm outstretched in the universal gesture of hitchhiking. What made me slow down wasn't kindness or good Samaritan instinct. It was shock. She was wearing a white dress. Just a dress, sleeveless and thin, the kind you'd wear to a summer party. No coat, no boots. Nothing to protect her from the killing cold. I should have kept driving. Every rational part of my brain told me to keep going, to call the RCMP from the next town and report someone in distress. But I didn't. Something made me pull over, made me stop my car on that dark, empty highway. I rolled down the passenger window as I came to a stop about 10 feet ahead of where she'd been standing. The cold air rushed in, and I could see my breath fogging in the interior light. "Are you okay?" I called out. She walked toward the car, her movements slow and deliberate. In my side mirror, I could see her clearly now in the red glow of my taillights. She looked young, maybe mid-20s, with long dark hair that hung loose around her shoulders. Her feet were bare on the frozen pavement, and the white dress clung to her thin frame. She opened the passenger door and got in without saying a word. The interior light illuminated her face, and I got my first clear look at her. She was pale, her lips slightly blue, but her expression was calm. She pulled the door closed and sat there, her hands folded in her lap, staring straight ahead through the windshield. "Jesus, you must be freezing," I said, immediately turning up the heat. "What are you doing out here? Where's your coat?" She didn't answer right away. She just sat there, and I noticed she wasn't shivering. Her skin was cold to the touch. I could feel the chill radiating from her, but she showed no physical signs of hypothermia. No trembling, no slurred speech, no confusion. "I'm going home," she finally said, her voice soft and even. "I'm late." "Where's home?" "I'm heading to Brandon, but I can take you to the nearest town. Get you warmed up, call someone to come get you." "Just drive," she said. "I'll tell you when to stop." There was something in her tone, not threatening, not demanding, but absolute. Like she knew exactly where she needed to go, and there was no point in arguing. So I put the car in drive and pulled back onto the highway. We drove in silence for maybe 20 minutes. She sat perfectly still, her eyes fixed on something in the distance that I couldn't see. I kept glancing at her, trying to figure out what was happening. Her dress was dry, no snow on it, no dampness from the cold. Her hair was clean and neat, like she'd just stepped out of a salon. But her feet were bare and dirty, the soles dark with old road grime. "What's your name?" I asked, trying to break the silence. "Sarah." "I'm Michael. Are you sure you're okay? You really should have a coat out here. It's dangerous in this cold." "I'm late," she said again, as if that explained everything. The headlights carved a tunnel through the darkness ahead, illuminating nothing but empty highway and snow-covered fields. We passed a sign indicating we were 40 kilometers from the next town. No buildings, no lights, just endless prairie. "Sarah, seriously, where do you need to go? I don't mind dropping you off, but I need to know where I'm taking you." "Stop here." The words came suddenly, urgently. I looked around. We were in the middle of nowhere. No houses, no intersections, nothing but flat land stretching away into the darkness on both sides of the highway. "There's nothing here," I said. "Here," she repeated more firmly. "Please." I slowed down and pulled onto the shoulder, the gravel crunching under my tires. I put the car in park and turned to look at her. "Sarah, I can't just leave you out here. You'll freeze to death. Let me take you to the next town. We can." She was already opening the door. The interior light came on, and she turned to look at me for the first time since getting in the car. Her eyes were dark, unreadable. "Thank you for the ride," she said. "I'm home now." She stepped out of the car and closed the door. I watched in my headlights as she walked around the front of the vehicle and stepped off the pavement into the snow-covered field. She was heading away from the road, her white dress bright against the darkness. I rolled down my window and called after her. "Sarah, wait, where are you going?" She didn't turn around. She just kept walking, her bare feet leaving tracks in the snow, moving steadily away from the highway. I watched her figure recede into the darkness, the white dress visible in my headlights until she crested a small rise in the land and disappeared from view. I sat there for a long moment, my heart pounding. This was wrong. Everything about this was wrong. A woman in a summer dress, walking into a frozen field in the middle of the night, in -20 weather, and I just let her go. I grabbed my phone and called 911. The dispatcher answered, and I tried to explain what had just happened. A hitchhiker, a woman in a white dress. She'd gotten out of my car and walked into a field. She was going to freeze to death if someone didn't find her. The dispatcher took down the information, my location, my description of Sarah, the direction she'd been walking. She told me to stay where I was, that she was sending RCMP officers from the nearest detachment. I waited in my car with the engine running, watching the field where Sarah had disappeared. I kept expecting to see her come back, to see the white dress reappear over the rise. But there was nothing, just darkness and wind, and the endless cold. The RCMP officer arrived about 30 minutes later, his cruiser pulling up behind my car with lights flashing. I got out and told him everything, the hitchhiker, the white dress, her walking into the field. He listened without interrupting, his expression growing more serious as I talked. "Did she tell you her name?" he asked. "Sarah, just Sarah." He was quiet for a long moment, then pulled out a flashlight and walked to the edge of the field where Sarah had entered. I followed him, and we could both see the tracks, 2 lines of footprints leading away from the highway, small and bare, disappearing into the darkness. "I'm going to call for additional units," he said. "We'll do a search, but you should go. It's New Year's Eve, and you said you were heading to Brandon. We'll take it from here." I didn't want to leave, but there was nothing I could do. I gave him my contact information and continued my drive, arriving at my parents' house around 1 in the morning. I didn't tell them what had happened. I just said I'd been delayed by work. The next day, New Year's Day, an RCMP officer called me. They'd found her, a mile from where I dropped her off, in the field. She'd frozen to death. But then he told me something that made my blood run cold. "We need you to come in and give a statement," he said, "because this doesn't make sense. The woman you picked up, her name was Sarah Delorme. She went missing on New Year's Eve 1999. 3 years ago, she was walking home from a party and never made it. We've been searching for her all this time." I felt like the ground had dropped out from under me. "That's impossible. She was in my car. She talked to me. She told me her name." "I believe you," the officer said quietly, "but Sarah Delorme has been dead for 3 years. We just didn't know where she was until you found her." I drove to the RCMP detachment in Brandon that afternoon and gave my statement. They showed me a photograph, a missing person poster from 1999. It was her. Same face, same dark hair. Sarah Delorme, age 24, last seen leaving a New Year's Eve party in a rural community outside Winnipeg. She'd been walking home, about 5 kilometers. She never made it. The theory was that she'd tried to hitchhike, maybe got disoriented in the cold, wandered into a field, and succumbed to hypothermia. Her body had been covered by snow, undiscovered for 3 years, until the night I picked her up. But that doesn't explain how she was in my car, how she talked to me, how she told me her name and said she was going home, how she walked into that field with purpose, knowing exactly where she needed to go. The RCMP had no explanation. "Hypothermia can cause hallucinations," they said. Maybe I'd been more tired than I realized, and I'd imagined the passenger. Maybe I'd seen the body in the field and constructed a narrative to make sense of it. But I know what happened. I gave her a ride. I felt the cold radiating from her skin. I heard her voice. She was real. I've driven that stretch of highway dozens of times since then, and I always slow down near the place where I picked her up. There's a small memorial there now, flowers, and a white cross marking where Sarah's body was found. Her family put it there after the funeral. And sometimes, late at night when I'm driving that road, I think I see her again, standing on the shoulder, her arm outstretched, her white dress bright against the darkness. But I never stop. I can't, because I think Sarah got what she wanted that night. She made it home. Not to her parents' house, not to the party she'd left 3 years earlier, but to the field where she'd fallen, where she'd closed her eyes for the last time. And she needed someone to take her there, someone to give her one last ride on New Year's Eve, completing a journey that had been interrupted 3 years before. I was that someone, and I'll carry that with me for the rest of my life, the memory of a dead woman sitting in my passenger seat, calm and quiet, going home after 3 long years of waiting in the cold. The harbor was packed. Thousands of people lined the Halifax waterfront, bundled in winter coats and scarves, their breath fogging in the cold December air. My girlfriend Emma and I had arrived early to stake out a good spot near the Maritime Museum, close enough to the water that we'd have an unobstructed view of the fireworks display. We'd been dating for about 8 months, and this was our first New Year's Eve together in the city. She'd moved to Halifax from Ontario in the spring, and I wanted to show her how the city celebrated. The crowd was in good spirits despite the cold. Families with kids, groups of friends passing flasks back and forth, couples like us huddled together for warmth. The harbor itself was dark, except for the lights from the buildings along the waterfront and the occasional boat moving through the water. The Dartmouth side was lit up across the harbor, and you could see people gathered there too, mirroring our crowd. As midnight approached, the energy built. People started counting down, checking their phones for the exact time. Emma squeezed my hand, her face bright with excitement. She loved fireworks, had told me stories about watching displays over Lake Ontario when she was a kid. The countdown reached 0, and the first firework launched from a barge anchored in the middle of the harbor. It screamed into the sky, trailing sparks, and exploded in a brilliant burst of red and gold. The crowd cheered. More fireworks followed, blues and greens and whites, cascading patterns that reflected off the dark water, the booms echoing between the buildings. We watched for maybe 2 minutes, Emma leaning against me, both of us tilting our heads back to see the explosions overhead. The display was beautiful, professional, perfectly choreographed. Then something went wrong. One of the fireworks launched at an angle instead of straight up. I saw it immediately. The trajectory was off, arcing sideways across the harbor instead of climbing into the sky. It shot over the water maybe 20 feet above the surface, trailing sparks, moving fast. It hit the water about 100 meters from shore and went out with a hiss, the sparks extinguishing instantly. A few people in the crowd laughed, pointing at where it had gone down. A dud, a misfire. These things happen, but I kept watching that spot where it had hit the water, because in the brief moment when the firework had illuminated the harbor's surface, I'd seen something, just a flash, but enough to make me uneasy. Movement, something in the water, something big. The next firework launched normally, exploding overhead in a pattern of silver streamers. But I wasn't watching the sky anymore. I was watching the water, scanning the dark surface for whatever I'd glimpsed. Emma noticed. "You okay?" I thought I saw something in the water when that firework went sideways. "Probably a seal," she said, "or a boat." But I knew the harbor. I'd grown up in Halifax, spent summers sailing and kayaking in these waters. What I'd seen didn't move like a seal, and it was too big, too fluid, to be a boat. Another firework arced across the harbor, not quite as severe as the first misfire, but low enough to illuminate the water's surface for a few seconds. And in that light, I saw it again. Something massive, just below the surface, dark and serpentine, moving with a sinuous motion that sent ripples spreading across the otherwise calm water. I could see the shape of it, coils or segments, something that looked organic rather than mechanical. "Emma, look at the water, right there," I pointed. She followed my gaze, squinting into the darkness. Another firework went up, this one normal, exploding overhead. But in its reflected light, we both saw it. A section of the thing broke the surface just briefly, just enough to show a massive dark shape, glistening wet, before it submerged again. It was maybe 50 meters from shore now, moving parallel to the waterfront. People around us started to notice. The murmuring began, spreading through the crowd like a wave, pointing fingers, confused voices. "What is that? Did you see that?" "Something's in the water." More fireworks launched, and each one illuminated the thing more clearly. It was circling the harbor, moving in a wide arc that would bring it closer to where the crowds were gathered. I could see it more distinctly now, massive coils, dark scales or skin, something that looked biological but impossibly large. Each time it broke the surface, you could see sections of its body, segments that suggested it was at least 50 or 60 feet long, maybe more. The crowd's mood was shifting from celebration to unease. The cheering had stopped. People were backing away from the water's edge, parents pulling their kids back, everyone staring at the harbor where this thing was circling. The fireworks display suddenly stopped. No announcement, no explanation, just silence, broken only by the murmuring of thousands of confused people and the sound of water lapping against the dock. Then we heard the sirens. Police cars and emergency vehicles appeared along the waterfront, their lights flashing. Officers started moving through the crowd, using loudspeakers to announce an evacuation. Please move away from the waterfront. This is not a drill. Please proceed to the street level calmly and quickly. There's been a safety incident. A safety incident. That's all they would say. The crowd began to move. Thousands of people trying to leave the waterfront at once. It was relatively orderly at first, but you could feel the panic underneath the surface. People kept looking back at the water, trying to see if the thing was still there. Emma grabbed my hand. Michael, what was that? I don't know. We let ourselves be swept along with the crowd, moving up from the waterfront toward the street. Police were everywhere now, creating barriers, directing people away from the harbor. I heard someone say the entire waterfront was being closed, that boats were being recalled, that no one was allowed near the water. We made it to a side street and stopped, catching our breath. Emma pulled out her phone, already checking social media. People are posting about it. Thousands of posts. Everyone saw it. I looked back toward the harbor. From our elevated position, I could see the water more clearly. The police had set up bright spotlights, scanning the surface. I could see Coast Guard vessels moving in, presumably searching for whatever we'd all witnessed. But the thing was gone. The water looked calm, undisturbed, except for the boats, like nothing had been there at all. We went back to Emma's apartment and stayed up most of the night, watching the news, refreshing social media. The official statement from the city came around 2 a.m. Due to a technical malfunction with the fireworks display, the New Year's Eve celebration was ended early as a safety precaution. We apologize for any inconvenience. No mention of what had been in the water. No acknowledgement that thousands of people had seen something massive moving through Halifax Harbor. The social media posts were everywhere, though. Videos taken on phones, shaky and unclear but showing something dark moving through the water. Photos of the massive shape breaking the surface. Eyewitness accounts from hundreds of people, all describing the same thing, something enormous, serpentine, circling the harbor during the fireworks. By morning, the posts were being taken down. Videos deleted or marked as violating community guidelines. News outlets weren't covering it. The official story was the fireworks malfunction, nothing more. But I couldn't let it go. I worked in marine biology, had connections at Dalhousie University and the Bedford Institute of Oceanography. I started making calls, asking questions. Most people wouldn't talk to me. But I had a friend who worked in oceanographic surveying, and she finally agreed to meet me for coffee a week after New Year's. You have to understand, she said. I could lose my job for telling you this, but I know you, and I know you won't drop it. Tell me what? She pulled out her phone and showed me a sonar image. Timestamp, December 31st, 11:50, 8 p.m. Location, Halifax Harbor. The image showed the harbor's bathymetry, the underwater topography. And there, clear as day, was a massive signature. Something in the water, something that showed up as a large, elongated object moving through the harbor. We picked this up on the harbor monitoring system, she said. The computers flagged it immediately because it didn't match any known vessel or marine life in the area. The signature suggests something between 50 and 80 feet long, moving at speeds inconsistent with any marine mammal we know of. What was it? We don't know. The official report says it was a equipment malfunction, that the sonar was reading false returns, maybe from turbulence or debris. But I've been doing this for 10 years, and I've never seen a malfunction create a signature like that. Did they send anyone to investigate? Coast Guard vessels searched the harbor for hours. They didn't find anything. Whatever it was, it's gone now. Or it went deeper, out to sea. Halifax Harbor connects to the Atlantic through a relatively narrow channel. If something wanted to leave, it could. I stared at the sonar image, my mind racing. Why keep it quiet? Because what do you say? That something massive and unidentified was swimming through one of Canada's busiest harbors on the biggest celebration night of the year? That thousands of people saw it, but we can't explain what it was? It's better to just say it was a fireworks malfunction and move on. She made me promise not to share the image, and I kept that promise. But I've kept a copy on an encrypted drive, and sometimes I look at it, trying to make sense of what we saw. Emma and I broke up a few months later. She said she couldn't stop thinking about that night, couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong with Halifax, with the harbor. She moved back to Ontario in the spring. I stayed. I still work in the same field, still have access to some of the harbor monitoring data, and I check it regularly. looking for any anomalies, any signs that whatever we saw might have come back. The harbor seems normal. Boats come and go. People swim and sail and kayak. Life goes on. But I've noticed something. Every year, around New Year's Eve, they cancel the harbor fireworks. The official reason is always different: budget cuts, safety concerns, weather predictions, but the result is the same. No fireworks over Halifax Harbor. And I wonder if that's a coincidence, or if someone, somewhere in the city administration or the Coast Guard or federal government knows something, knows that it's not safe to light up the harbor on New Year's Eve, knows that something might be attracted to the lights and sounds, something that lives in the deep waters of the Atlantic but occasionally ventures into the harbor, something that thousands of people saw on New Year's Eve 2003, circling in the dark water, illuminated only by misfired fireworks. I still go down to the waterfront sometimes, especially on New Year's Eve. I stand where Emma and I stood that night, looking out at the dark water, watching for any sign of movement. I haven't seen it again, but I know it's out there, somewhere in the depths where the sonar can't reach, where the harbor meets the open ocean, waiting. And I think about what it means that something that large, that unknown, can exist so close to a major city, can swim into our harbor, be seen by thousands of people, and then simply disappear, with no explanation, no investigation, no acknowledgement that it was ever there at all. That terrifies me more than the creature itself. The fact that we saw it, documented it, and were told to forget about it. The fact that official channels can make something that significant simply vanish from the record. Because if they can do that, what else are they hiding? What else is out there, in the waters off our coast, swimming beneath ships and submarines and all our monitoring equipment? What else is real that we've been told doesn't exist? I don't have answers. All I have is that memory, that sonar image, and the certainty that on New Year's Eve 2003, something massive and unknown swam through Halifax Harbor. And the knowledge that it's still out there somewhere, waiting for the next time someone lights up the water. My grandfather died on a Tuesday in November, 2 days before Thanksgiving. It was a heart attack, sudden and final, the kind of death that leaves no time for goodbyes. One moment he was raking leaves in the yard of the house he'd lived in for 50 years, and the next he was gone. My grandmother found him lying in a pile of maple leaves, the rake still in his hand, his face peaceful, like he'd just decided to lie down and rest. The funeral was small. Our family had always been small: my grandmother and grandfather, my mother and her brother, my younger sister and me. A few cousins from out of province made the trip, but mostly it was just us, sitting in the funeral home chapel in Corner Brook, Newfoundland, listening to a minister who'd never met my grandfather talk about a man he didn't know. My grandmother didn't cry at the funeral. She sat in the front pew, her hands folded in her lap, her expression blank and distant. She'd barely spoken since finding him in the yard, just went through the motions of planning the service, accepting condolences, nodding when people said things like, "He's in a better place," or "At least he didn't suffer." After the funeral, she retreated into silence. She still lived in the house, still cooked meals and kept things tidy, but there was something absent about her. Like part of her had followed my grandfather wherever he'd gone. The weeks leading up to Christmas were difficult. My mother tried to get my grandmother to come stay with us, but she refused. She wanted to be in her own house, surrounded by her own things. My mother and uncle took turns visiting her, bringing groceries, checking to make sure she was eating and taking care of herself. When December 31st approached, my mother suggested we cancel the usual New Year's tradition. Our family had always gathered at my grandparents' house for midnight, doing a champagne toast to ring in the new year. It had been my grandfather's tradition, something he'd insisted on for as long as I could remember. He'd pour the champagne cheap stuff from the liquor store, nothing fancy, and we'd all raise our glasses and toast to health and happiness in the year ahead. But my grandmother wouldn't hear of canceling. Frank would want us to keep the tradition, she said. It was the most she'd said in weeks. So we gathered at the house on New Year's Eve. My parents, my uncle and his wife, my sister and me. We brought food and drinks, tried to make it feel festive, but the atmosphere was heavy with grief. My grandfather's absence was everywhere: in the empty chair by the fireplace, in the silence where his booming laugh should have been, in the way my grandmother moved through the house like a ghost herself. We watched the countdown on TV, making small talk, avoiding any real conversation about how we were all feeling. My mother kept checking on my grandmother, who sat quietly in her usual chair, watching the screen without really seeing it. As midnight approached, my uncle got up and went to the kitchen. He came back with a bottle of champagne and the 6 glass flutes my grandparents had used for every New Year's toast I could remember. He poured carefully, filling each glass, and handed them around. We stood in the living room, the TV showing the countdown from Street John's, the numbers ticking down to 0. My grandfather's chair sat empty by the fireplace, exactly where it had been for the last 30 years. No one had moved it. No one had even suggested moving it. The countdown reached midnight. On the TV, people were cheering and hugging and kissing. In our living room, we stood in uncomfortable silence, holding our glasses. My grandmother suddenly stood up. She was holding her glass, but her hand was shaking slightly. She turned to face my grandfather's empty chair and raised her glass toward it. "To Frank," she said clearly, her voice stronger than it had been in weeks. And then we all saw it. The chair moved. Not a lot, just a slight shift, a subtle settling, like someone had sat down in it. The leather creaked, that familiar sound we'd all heard 1,000 times when my grandfather lowered himself into his favorite chair. My uncle dropped his glass. It shattered on the hardwood floor, champagne spreading in a puddle around his feet. My mother made a small sound, something between a gasp and a sob. My sister grabbed my arm, her fingernails digging into my skin. But my grandmother just smiled. She sat back down in her chair, still holding her glass, looking at the empty chair across from her like she could see something we couldn't. "He always comes back for New Year's," she said quietly, almost to herself. Frank never liked to miss the toast. We all stood frozen, staring at that chair. I could see the indentation in the leather cushion, the way the chair looked when someone was sitting in it, but there was no one there. Nothing visible, anyway. And then we heard it. A voice. My grandfather's voice, unmistakable and clear. "Happy New Year." It didn't come from the chair. It came from everywhere, from the walls, from the air itself, surrounding us, filling the room. The same voice I'd heard my whole life. The same slight Newfoundland accent, the same warmth. My mother started crying. My uncle backed toward the door, his face pale. My sister was shaking beside me, her hand still gripping my arm so hard it hurt. But my grandmother just sat there, smiling, raising her glass to the empty chair. "Happy New Year, Frank," she said softly. I don't remember leaving the living room. I just remember being in the kitchen, all of us except my grandmother, speaking in hushed, frightened voices. My mother wanted to call someone, the priest, a doctor, anyone. My uncle thought we should get my grandmother out of the house, take her to our place where she'd be safe. But safe from what? From my grandfather? From a voice we'd all heard, clear as anything, wishing us Happy New Year? My sister thought we'd all imagined it, some kind of collective grief, hallucination. But we'd all heard the same thing. We'd all seen the chair move. You can't hallucinate something that specific, that detailed, all at the same time. Eventually, we went back to the living room. My grandmother was still sitting in her chair, finishing her champagne, looking more peaceful than she had since November. The TV was still playing, some recap of New Year's celebrations across the country. My grandfather's chair looked normal now, no indentation, no sign that anyone had been sitting in it. "Gran," my mother said carefully, "what just happened?" My grandmother looked at her like she'd asked the most obvious question in the world. "Frank came for the toast, like he always does, like he always will. But grandfather is dead." "Yes, I know." She set down her empty glass. "But he promised me he'd never miss New Year's, and Frank always keeps his promises." We tried to talk to her about it, tried to get her to explain or to tell us what she thought had happened. But she wouldn't engage. She just kept saying that Frank had come for the toast, that it was perfectly natural, that we shouldn't be surprised. We left around 1 in the morning, all of us shaken and confused. My sister stayed with me that night, too scared to be alone. We sat up talking until dawn, trying to make sense of what we'd experienced. Over the next few days, I tried to convince myself there was a rational explanation. Old houses settle, leather chairs shift on their own sometimes, and the voice, maybe it had been the TV, or someone outside, or our own minds playing tricks on us in our grief. But I knew better. We'd all heard it. We'd all seen that chair move. And my grandmother's reaction, the certainty, the lack of surprise, suggested this wasn't the first time. I went to visit her a week later, bringing groceries and checking to make sure she was okay. She was in better spirits than I'd seen her since the funeral. humming as she put away the food I'd brought. "Gran," I said carefully, "about New Year's Eve." She smiled. "Frank always loved New Year's. It was his favorite holiday. He used to say it was the one night when you could really feel time moving, when you could stand on the edge between what was and what would be." "Did he? Has he come back before?" She looked at me, and for a moment I saw something in her eyes, a knowledge, a certainty about things beyond what I understood. "Frank and I were married for 52 years, she said. "You don't spend that long with someone and then just let them go completely. He's still here, maybe not the way he was, but he's here, and he'll always come back for New Year's, because he promised." She wouldn't say more than that, and I learned not to ask. The next New Year's Eve, my family gathered again at my grandmother's house. None of us talked about what had happened the previous year, but we all knew. When midnight came, my grandmother stood and raised her glass to my grandfather's empty chair. "To Frank," she said. This time we were watching. We were all watching that chair, waiting. It moved, the same subtle shift, the same creak of leather, and this time I swear I saw something just for a moment, just at the edge of my vision. The suggestion of a shape in the chair, not solid, not fully there, but something. "Happy New Year." The voice came again, surrounding us. My grandfather's voice as clear as if he were standing in the room. My grandmother smiled. "Happy New Year, Frank." My mother raised her glass with shaking hands. My uncle did the same. One by one, we all raised our glasses to that empty chair, toasting a man who was dead but somehow still keeping his promise. It's been years now, and my grandmother is still in that house. She's in her 80s, but she refuses to move, refuses to leave the place she shared with my grandfather for so long. And every New Year's Eve, our family gathers there. We don't talk about what happens at midnight. We don't discuss the chair, or the voice, or the presence we all feel in that room when the clock strikes 12. We just accept it as part of the tradition now. My grandfather's chair is always reserved. No one sits in it, not even when we have guests or extended family over. Everyone knows it's Frank's chair, and it stays empty year-round, waiting, except for midnight on New Year's Eve. Because that's when he comes back. That's when the chair settles like someone's sitting in it. When we hear his voice wishing us Happy New Year. When my grandmother smiles and talks to him like he never left. I've stopped trying to understand it. I've stopped trying to explain it to friends or partners who ask why we have such strange New Year's traditions. How do you explain to someone that your dead grandfather keeps his promise to toast the New Year with his family? How do you make them understand that some bonds don't break, even when death should have severed them completely? All I know is that every year, at midnight on New Year's Eve, I stand in my grandmother's living room with a glass of cheap champagne, and I toast to my grandfather's empty chair. And every year, I hear his voice, and I feel his presence, and I'm reminded that there are things in this world that exist beyond our understanding. Things that persist beyond death, promises that outlast the living, love that refuses to end, even when everything else does. And every year, as I leave my grandmother's house in the early hours of New Year's Day, I wonder what will happen when she's gone. Will my grandfather still come back for the toast? Will we still gather in that living room, raising our glasses to 2 empty chairs instead of 1? I don't know, but I suspect we will, because some traditions are stronger than death. Some promises last forever, and because I think, deep down, that we're all a little bit afraid of what might happen if we stopped showing up. If we broke the tradition, ended the ritual, stopped reserving that chair. We're afraid that Frank might stop coming back, or worse, that he might come back angry, betrayed by our failure to keep our end of the tradition. So we keep gathering, we keep toasting, we keep that chair empty and waiting, because my grandfather never liked to miss New Year's. And Frank always keeps his promises. I stayed in on New Year's Eve 2019. I'd been invited to a couple of parties, but I wasn't feeling social. I'd had a rough year, lost my job in October, gone through a bad breakup in September, been struggling with anxiety and insomnia. The idea of forcing myself to be cheerful and celebratory felt exhausting, so I decided to spend the night alone in my apartment in Victoria, BC. Around 11:30, I poured myself a small glass of wine and sat down with a notebook to write out my resolutions for 2020. I know a lot of people think New Year's resolutions are pointless, but I'd always found the ritual comforting. A fresh start, a chance to set intentions, a way to convince myself that things could be different. I wrote down the usual stuff. lose 15 pounds, save more money, be more organized, exercise 3 times a week, read more books, drink less. The list of things I told myself every year, knowing I'd probably abandon most of them by February. When I finished, I took the list into the bathroom and taped it to the mirror the way I always did. Seeing my resolutions every morning was supposed to help keep me accountable. I looked at my reflection as I smoothed down the tape, 32 years old, tired eyes, the beginning of lines around my mouth. I made a mental note to add, "Take better care of my skin," to the list. I went to bed around 12:30. After watching the countdown on TV alone, I'd had maybe a glass and a half of wine total. Barely enough to feel anything, certainly not enough to get drunk. The next morning, New Year's Day, I woke up around 9 with a slight headache, dehydration, more than hangover. I shuffled to the bathroom and was brushing my teeth when I noticed something odd about the resolution list taped to my mirror. There was an additional item at the bottom, written in handwriting that wasn't mine. "Don't look in the mirror at 3 a.m. I stopped brushing and leaned closer, reading it again. The handwriting was different from mine, smaller, more cramped. The letters formed in a way that looked old-fashioned, like someone who'd learned cursive in a different era. But it was written in the same blue pen I'd used, or at least a pen of the same color. I felt a chill run down my spine despite the warm bathroom. I lived alone. I'd been alone all night. The apartment doors were locked. I'd checked them before bed, a habit born from years of living in the city. The windows were all secure, and I was on the 4th floor anyway. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe I had written it and forgotten. Maybe I'd been more drunk than I thought. But I'd only had a glass and a half of wine, and the handwriting was so clearly not mine. I peeled the list off the mirror and examined it more closely. My resolutions were in my handwriting, no question. But that last line was different. The ink looked the same age as the rest, not newer, not added later with a different pen, like it had been written at the same time, but by someone else. I checked my apartment thoroughly. Every room, every closet, under the bed, behind the shower curtain. Nothing. No signs of intrusion, no evidence that anyone had been there. The doors were still locked from the inside. The chain was still engaged. The windows were sealed shut, the way they had been since I moved in. I went back to the bathroom and stared at that additional line. Don't look in the mirror at 3 a.m. Why 3 a.m. specifically? And why would I, or anyone, write that? I told myself I was being paranoid. I'd probably written it as a joke to myself, some half-remembered thought about the witching hour, or whatever. I crumpled up the list and threw it in the trash, then took a shower and tried to forget about it. But I couldn't shake the unease. All day, I kept thinking about that handwriting, so clearly different from mine, about the impossibility of someone entering my apartment without leaving any trace, about the specificity of the warning, not "don't look in mirrors at night," or "avoid 3 a.m., but specifically, "don't look in the mirror at 3 a.m. That night, I went to bed around 11, determined to sleep through the entire night. I was exhausted anyway, hadn't been sleeping well for weeks. I thought I'd have no trouble staying asleep. I woke up at exactly 3 a.m. I know it was exactly 3, because the first thing I saw when I opened my eyes was my phone on the nightstand, the time glowing in the darkness. 3 a.m. Not 2:59 or 3:01, but precisely 3. I lay there for a moment, disoriented. I hadn't woken naturally. It felt like something had pulled me from sleep, some external force or sound. But the apartment was silent. No sirens outside, no neighbors making noise, nothing. I needed to use the bathroom. I'd had a lot of water before bed, trying to flush out the wine from the night before, and my bladder was uncomfortably full. I got up and walked to the bathroom, still half asleep. I flipped on the light without thinking and moved toward the toilet. And then I stopped. The mirror was right there, above the sink. I was standing directly in front of it, and suddenly I remembered, don't look in the mirror at 3 a.m. But it was too late. I'd already looked. At first, I saw what I expected, my own reflection, bleary-eyed and disheveled in my pajamas. The bathroom behind me, empty. The shower curtain pulled back, the toilet, the towel rack. And then I saw them. There was someone standing behind me in the reflection, not in the actual bathroom. When I spun around, there was no one there. The bathroom was empty, but in the mirror, they were there, standing right behind where my reflection should have been, close enough that I should have felt their breath on my neck, close enough to touch. I turned back to the mirror, my heart hammering. They were still there, still standing behind my reflection, and now I could see their face clearly. It was my face, but wrong. The features were mine. Same nose, same mouth, same general structure. But the face was older, more gaunt, the skin pulled tight over the bones. The eyes were the worst. They were completely black. Not just the pupils, but the entire eye, iris, and sclera alike. Just solid black orbs staring out from my face. The thing that wore my face raised one hand slowly. I watched, frozen, as it reached toward the mirror's surface from its side. Its finger touched the glass and began to write. The letters appeared backwards from my perspective, but I could read them easily, written in the condensation, or dust, or whatever medium exists on the other side of mirrors. You should have listened. The reflection smiled, my mouth, my teeth, but the expression was wrong, too wide, too knowing. I stumbled backward, nearly falling. I hit the light switch, plunging the bathroom into darkness, and ran to my bedroom. I slammed the door shut, locked it, and crawled into bed, pulling the covers over my head like a child. I stayed there until daylight, my heart racing, my mind trying to process what I'd seen. When morning finally came, I went back to the bathroom with my eyes half closed, moving carefully to avoid looking directly at the mirror. I used the toilet, washed my hands with my gaze fixed on the faucet, and left. I covered the bathroom mirror with a towel that day. Then, when that felt insufficient, I took it down entirely and turned it to face the wall. I couldn't bring myself to look at it, couldn't stand the thought of what might be looking back. Over the next few weeks, I covered or removed every reflective surface in my apartment. The mirror in the bedroom, the glass on picture frames, anything that could show my reflection. I became obsessive about it, even covering the screen of my TV when it was turned off. My friends noticed I looked different. I'd stopped wearing makeup, couldn't apply it without a mirror. I'd stopped styling my hair for the same reason. I looked increasingly unkempt, increasingly unhinged. I tried to tell one friend about what had happened, but the words sounded insane even to me. I saw an evil version of myself in the mirror at 3 a.m. and now I can't look at my reflection. She suggested I see a therapist, said it sounded like I was having a breakdown. Maybe I was, maybe I am, but I know what I saw. I know that something wearing my face stood behind my reflection that night, something that existed on the other side of mirrors, in that space between glass and backing, in that thin layer of silver that shows us ourselves, but reversed. I've moved twice since then, different apartments, different cities, but it doesn't matter, because mirrors are everywhere. In bathrooms and bedrooms, in stores and restaurants, in car windows and phone screens. And I'm terrified of what I might see if I look at the wrong time. I set alarms now, multiple alarms, to make sure I'm awake before 3 a.m. or asleep after it. I never want to be unconscious at that hour, never want to risk waking up and reflexively looking at a reflective surface. But sometimes I fail. Sometimes I wake up naturally, and I check my phone before remembering, and it's 3 a.m. exactly. And in those moments, I keep my eyes fixed straight ahead, moving through my apartment by memory and touch, avoiding every surface that might show my reflection. Because I know it's still there, still waiting on the other side of mirrors, still wearing my face, still smiling that wrong smile. I found the crumpled resolution list in my trash a few days after that night. I'd smoothed it out and read it again, that warning written in someone else's handwriting. Don't look in the mirror at 3 a.m. Someone had tried to warn me. Someone who knew what would happen if I looked. But I don't know who wrote it. I don't know how they got into my apartment to add that line to my list. Unless it wasn't someone in my apartment at all. Unless it was something that had access from the other side. Something that could reach through mirrors and leave messages. Something that wanted to warn me but knew I wouldn't listen. Or maybe it was a test. Maybe whatever lives on the other side of mirrors wanted to see if I would obey a warning from an unknown source. And when I didn't, when I looked anyway, it marked me somehow, claimed me. I don't have answers. All I have is the knowledge that something is watching me from the other side of reflective surfaces. Something that looks like me but isn't me. Something that knows my face better than I do, that wears it like a mask in a place I can't reach. And I have the certainty that at 3 a.m., the barrier between our worlds is thinner. That at that specific hour, what should be impossible becomes possible. That I can see them and they can see me, and the only thing protecting me is not looking. So I don't look. I don't look in mirrors at 3 a.m. I don't look in windows or screens or any surface that might show my reflection at that hour. Because I saw what's waiting there. I saw my face with black eyes and that terrible smile. And I know that someday, if I look again, it might not just be watching anymore. It might reach through. I was alone in my apartment in Edmonton on New Year's Eve, watching the Toronto celebration on TV like I did every year. I'd grown up in Toronto and still felt connected to the city, even though I'd moved west for work 5 years earlier. Watching the countdown at Nathan Phillips Square was tradition, a way of staying connected to home. The broadcast started around 11 p.m., the usual covered shots of the square packed with people bundled in winter coats, their breath fogging in the cold December air. The host was enthusiastic, interviewing people in the crowd, showing the stage where various musicians had performed throughout the evening. Everything was normal, festive, exactly what you'd expect from a New Year's Eve broadcast. I had my laptop open on the coffee table, half watching the TV while scrolling through social media, seeing posts from friends at parties and gatherings. I'd been invited to a few myself, but I wasn't in the mood for crowds or noise. I was content to watch the countdown alone, with a beer and some leftover pizza. Around 11:55, as the broadcast was building toward the midnight countdown, I closed my laptop to give the TV my full attention. This was always my favorite part, the final moments of the old year, the energy of thousands of people coming together to mark the transition to something new. The host was counting down the minutes. 4 minutes to midnight, 3 minutes. The camera panned across the crowd, showing faces bright with anticipation. The stage was lit up, ready for the fireworks that would launch at midnight. 2 minutes to go. And then the feed cut out. The screen went black. Not the kind of black you get when you change channels. This was different, deeper. Like the TV was showing me pure absence, pure nothing. I sat forward, assuming it was a technical glitch. These things happen during live broadcasts, especially with the signal traveling across the country. The black screen lasted maybe 5 seconds. Then the image came back. It was still Nathan Phillips Square. I could see the distinctive arches of the new city hall, the curved towers lit up against the night sky. I could see the crowd, still packed in tight, still in the same spot. But something was wrong. The people weren't celebrating anymore. They were standing perfectly still. Every single person visible on screen, maybe hundreds of them in the camera's field of view, was motionless. Not the kind of still you get when people are waiting for something, but the kind of frozen stillness that looks unnatural, like someone had hit pause on reality. And they were all facing the same direction. Every face turned towards something off camera, towards something the broadcast wasn't showing. Their expressions were wrong, not excited or happy, or even bored. They looked blank, empty. But underneath that blankness, I could see something else. Fear. The audio was gone. No music from the stage, no crowd noise, no voiceover from the host. Just complete silence coming from my TV speakers. It was so quiet I could hear my refrigerator humming in the kitchen, could hear my own breathing. The camera began to pan slowly across the crowd. It was a smooth, deliberate movement, showing face after face. Young and old, men and women, people who moments before had been celebrating and laughing and taking selfies. Now they were all frozen, all staring at the same thing, all wearing that same expression of blank terror. I felt my skin prickle. This wasn't right. This wasn't a technical glitch. Something had happened in that square. Something that had stopped thousands of people in their tracks. The camera continued its pan, moving across the crowd with agonizing slowness. I wanted to look away but couldn't. Each face it showed was worse than the last. Some people had their mouths open, like they'd been caught mid-scream. Some had tears running down their frozen faces. Children stood motionless beside their parents, their small faces showing the same blank terror. And then the camera began to turn. Slowly, deliberately, it pivoted toward whatever the crowd was looking at, toward whatever had frozen thousands of people in simultaneous horror. I leaned forward without meaning to, my hands gripping the edge of the coffee table. Part of me didn't want to see. Part of me wanted to turn off the TV right then, to spare myself whatever was about to be revealed. But I couldn't move. I could only watch as the camera continued its slow turn, the edge of the crowd sliding out of frame as the camera pointed toward the thing they were all staring at. I caught a glimpse of something in the distance, something large, something that shouldn't have been there. And then the feed cut out again. Black screen, complete darkness, silence. I sat there, my heart hammering, staring at the black screen. 5 seconds passed. 10. Then the image came back, and it was the normal broadcast. The host was back, smiling at the camera, saying something about technical difficulties and, "We're sorry for the interruption." Behind him, the crowd was moving again, celebrating, counting down. Everything was normal. Everything was exactly as it should have been. The countdown continued. 10, 9, 8. Fireworks launched into the sky. Midnight arrived. The new year began. People cheered and hugged and kissed, like nothing had happened. I grabbed my phone and immediately checked social media. People were posting about the broadcast, about the countdown, about their New Year's celebrations, but no one was mentioning the interruption. No one was talking about the frozen crowd or the silence or the thing the camera had started to show before the feed cut out. I refreshed and refreshed, searching for any mention of what I'd seen. Nothing. Just normal New Year's posts. Celebrations and resolutions and photos of people toasting with champagne. I went to the broadcaster's website, looking for information. Nothing there either. The broadcast had apparently gone smoothly from start to finish. No technical issues, no interruptions. But I'd seen it. I'd watched thousands of people freeze in terror, had seen them all staring at something off camera, had seen the camera start to pan toward whatever it was. And I'd recorded it. I always recorded the New Year's countdown, had done it for years as a way of archiving the moment. I had a DVR set up to capture the broadcast automatically. I rewound to 11:55 and watched it again. There it was, the feed cutting out at 11:57, the black screen, the image coming back showing the frozen crowd, the slow pan across those terrified faces, the camera beginning to turn toward whatever they were looking at, and then the cut back to normal programming. I saved the recording to a thumb drive, then uploaded it to my computer, making multiple backups. This was real, this had happened, and I had proof. The next morning, New Year's Day, I called the broadcaster's main line. After being transferred 3 times, I reached someone in the technical department. "I'm calling about the broadcast interruption last night," I said, during the New Year's countdown from Nathan Phillips Square. "I'm sorry, sir, but there were no technical difficulties with last night's broadcast. It went smoothly from start to finish." "That's not true. The feed cut out at 11:57. When it came back, the crowd was frozen. Everyone was staring at something off camera. Then it cut out again and came back to normal." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Sir, I'm looking at our technical logs right now. There were no interruptions, no feed issues, no problems of any kind. The broadcast was flawless. I have it recorded. I can show you the footage." Another pause, longer this time. "Sir, if you believe you witnessed something unusual, you're welcome to submit a formal complaint through our website, but I can assure you there were no technical issues with our broadcast." I tried to press further, but the person became less responsive, eventually saying they had to go and directing me to the website again. I posted about it online, uploaded a clip of the footage. Within hours, the post was flagged and removed for violating community standards. I tried other platforms, same result. Every time I uploaded the footage, it was taken down within hours. I tried sending it to local news stations, to independent journalists, to anyone who might investigate. No one responded. The few who did said the footage looked like a hoax or suggested I'd edited it myself. But I didn't edit anything. I just recorded what was broadcast into my home. I've watched the footage hundreds of times now, studying every frame, the frozen crowd, the blank, terrified faces, the slow pan of the camera toward whatever they were looking at. I've tried to zoom in on the last few frames before the feed cuts out, trying to see what's there in the distance, what the camera was turning toward. But the resolution isn't good enough. There's just a dark shape, barely visible, something large in the distance. Something that shouldn't have been there. I've looked for other witnesses, searched for any mention of what I saw, any indication that someone else noticed the interruption. But I've found nothing. If anyone else recorded it, they're staying silent. Sometimes I think I imagined it, that I fell asleep watching the broadcast and dreamed the whole thing, that the footage on my thumb drive is somehow corrupted or edited without my knowledge. But I know what I saw. Thousands of people in Nathan Phillips Square, frozen in terror, all staring at the same thing. And I know that whatever it was, the broadcast was cut before it could be shown. Someone decided we shouldn't see what was there. Someone with the power to interrupt a national broadcast, to erase the interruption from the technical logs, to scrub mentions of it from the internet. And I think about what that means, about what could be so terrible that thousands of people would freeze in simultaneous horror just from looking at it, about what could require that kind of coordinated cover-up. I don't watch the New Year's broadcast anymore, haven't since that night. I can't risk seeing it again, can't risk witnessing whatever happens when the feed doesn't cut out, when someone fails to stop the broadcast before the camera completes its turn. Because I think it's still there. Whatever was in Nathan Phillips Square that night, whatever those people saw, I think it returns every New Year's Eve. And every year, someone cuts the feed before we can see it. Every year, the broadcast continues as if nothing happened. But it did happen. I have proof. I have the footage. And sometimes, late at night, I watch it again. I watch those frozen faces, that slow camera pan, and I try to see what's there in those last frames before the cut. I try to see what was so terrible that thousands of people couldn't move, couldn't scream, could only stand and stare. And I'm terrified that someday, I'll figure it out, that I'll zoom in far enough, enhance the image enough, and I'll see what they saw. And then I'll be like them, frozen, staring, unable to look away. Because whatever it is, whatever appears in Nathan Phillips Square at midnight on New Year's Eve, it's still there, still waiting, still being broadcast into homes across Canada, while someone scrambles to cut the feed before we can see. And someday, they might be too late. Someday, we might all see it. And then we'll all be standing perfectly still, staring, wearing that same expression of blank terror. Just like the people in the square. Just like the thousands who saw something that shouldn't exist and couldn't look away. My friends and I booked a week at a ski lodge in Whistler for New Year's. 6 of us splitting the cost of 2 rooms. We'd been planning it for months, a week of snowboarding, après ski drinks, and ringing in the new year somewhere beautiful. The lodge was called Cascade Peak, an older property that had been operating since the 80s, with that classic mountain lodge aesthetic, timber beams, stone fireplaces, and a view of the slopes that was worth the price alone. We arrived on December 28th, and the first few days were perfect. Clear weather, fresh powder, the slopes mostly empty, as we were there between the Christmas rush and the New Year's influx. Our rooms were on the 3rd floor, small but comfortable, with views of the mountain and the valley below. New Year's Eve arrived with a fresh snowfall that had the whole mountain looking pristine and magical. The lodge was hosting a celebration that night, open bar, live band, a champagne toast at midnight. Everyone was in good spirits, and by 9 o'clock the lobby and common areas were packed with guests in festive clothes, drinks in hand, music filling the space. I was with my friends, drinking and dancing, when I realized I was freezing. I'd come down to the party in just a sweater, not thinking about how cold the lodge could get, and now I was shivering. Around 11, I told my friends I was running upstairs to grab my heavier jacket. The 3rd floor was quiet when I got off the elevator, the sounds of the party muffled by distance and the thick carpet in the hallways. Most guests were downstairs celebrating. I walked to my room 314 and unlocked the door with my keycard. The lights were off inside, but enough light came from the hallway that I could see into the room, and that's when I noticed him. Someone was sitting on my bed, an older man, maybe 70, sitting with perfect posture on the edge of the mattress. He was wearing a dark suit that looked oddly formal and old-fashioned, the kind of cut you'd see in photographs from the 80s or early 90s. His hair was gray and neatly combed, and his hands were folded in his lap. He looked up at me and smiled. "Happy New Year," he said. His voice was warm, grandfatherly. I stood in the doorway, confused and increasingly alarmed. "Who are you? How did you get in my room?" He stood up slowly, brushing off his slacks like he'd been sitting there for a while and wanted to look presentable. He walked toward me, and I instinctively stepped back into the hallway. "I always come back for New Year's," he said, his tone conversational, like we were old friends chatting. "This was my favorite place. This is my room. You can't be in here." I was trying to keep my voice steady, trying to figure out if I should be scared or just annoyed. He didn't look threatening, just an old man in an outdated suit, but the fact that he'd been sitting on my bed, in my locked room, was deeply unsettling. He walked past me into the hallway, not hurried but not slow either, just a normal walking pace, like he had somewhere to be. He looked back at me once more, that same gentle smile on his face. "You have a wonderful evening," he said. "It's going to be a good year." Then he turned and walked down the hallway toward the elevator. I followed him, keeping a distance. "Hey, wait, I'm calling security. You can't just break into people's rooms." He didn't respond, just kept walking, his footsteps silent on the carpet. I was maybe 20 feet behind him, and I watched as he approached the elevator bay at the end of the hall. And then he was gone. Not gradually, not around a corner or into a room. He was there, walking toward the elevator, and then he wasn't. Like he'd simply ceased to exist mid-step. I ran to where he'd been, looking around frantically. The hallway was empty. The elevator hadn't moved. I could see both cars were on other floors, their position indicators showing one on the ground floor and one on 5. The stairwell door was closed, and when I checked it, there was no sound of footsteps from inside. He'd vanished. I stood there in the empty hallway, my heart pounding, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. Had he ducked into one of the rooms? But I'd been watching him the whole time, and he hadn't touched any doors. I went back to my room and checked inside thoroughly. Nothing was disturbed. My jacket was where I'd left it on the chair. My belongings were untouched. If the old man had been in here, he hadn't done anything except sit on the bed. I grabbed my jacket and went back downstairs, shaken. I found my friends at the party and pulled one of them aside. "Something weird just happened," I said, and explained about finding the man in my room, about him disappearing in the hallway. My friend laughed, assuming I was drunk. "Maybe it was a ghost," he joked. "I'm serious. Dude, it's New Year's Eve. You've had a few drinks. You probably saw another guest, got confused about which floor you were on, and now you're freaking out." But I knew what I'd seen, and I couldn't shake the memory of that man sitting on my bed, the outdated suit, the way he'd smiled at me. "This was my favorite place," he'd said. Not is, was. I left my friends and went to the front desk. There was a young woman working, maybe mid-20s, wearing a festive reindeer sweater. I asked to speak to her privately, away from the other guests. "I need to report something strange," I said. "There was a man in my room, an older man, maybe 70, wearing an old-fashioned suit. He said something about coming back for New Year's, and this being his favorite place. Then he disappeared in the hallway." The clerk's face changed. The friendly, professional smile faded, replaced by something that looked like recognition and unease. "Can you describe him more specifically?" she asked quietly. I did. The gray hair, the dark suit, the formal bearing, the way he'd smiled. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she bent down behind the desk and pulled out a file folder, the kind with old photographs and documents. She flipped through it and pulled out a photo, placing it on the counter in front of me. The photo showed the lodge from the outside, a sunny day, the mountains in the background. It looked like it had been taken in the mid-80s based on the cars in the parking lot and the style of the photo itself. And standing in front of the lodge, wearing a dark suit and smiling at the camera, was the man I'd just seen. "Is this him?" she asked. "Yes, exactly him. Who is he?" She took a breath. "His name was Robert Whitmore. He was the original owner of Cascade Peak. He built this lodge in 1983, ran it for 4 years. He loved this place. It was his dream project." "What happened to him?" "He died here, December 31st, 1987, New Year's Eve. He was decorating the exterior of the lodge for the party, hanging lights from the roof. He fell, 3 stories. They found his body on New Year's morning." I felt cold despite my jacket. "And guests see him?" She nodded. "Not every year, but often enough that the staff knows about it. Always on New Year's Eve, always around this time of night. He appears in different rooms, different hallways. Guests report seeing an older man in an old-fashioned suit. Sometimes he speaks to them, sometimes he just smiles and disappears." "Why didn't anyone warn us? Why isn't this public knowledge?" "Because it would be bad for business, and because he's harmless. He never hurts anyone, never scares anyone intentionally. He just comes back to check on his lodge, to be here for New Year's one more time." I thought about that, about a man who loved something so much that even death couldn't keep him away, about a spirit tethered to a place by affection rather than trauma. "What does he do?" I asked. "When he appears?" "According to the reports, he walks through the lodge, visits rooms, checks things, like he's making sure everything is ready for the party. And then, at midnight, he disappears. Every time, right at midnight, he's gone." I looked at my watch. It was 11:40, 20 minutes until midnight. Has anyone ever talked to him, had a conversation? Some guests have tried. He usually just smiles and says something about how this is his favorite place, how he's glad people are enjoying it. Then he leaves. We've never had a report of him staying past midnight. I thanked her and went back to the party, but I couldn't focus on the celebration. I kept thinking about Robert Whitmore sitting on my bed, dressed in his finest suit, checking on his lodge one last time. I thought about how he must have loved this place, to come back year after year, even in death. The countdown began. Everyone gathered in the main lobby, champagne glasses in hand. 10, 9, 8. I found myself scanning the crowd, looking for that familiar face in the old-fashioned suit. 7, 6, 5. People were cheering, hugging, preparing for the new year. 4, 3, 2, 1. Midnight. Fireworks exploded outside, visible through the large windows. People kissed and cheered. Auld Lang Syne began playing. And I thought about Robert Whitmore, wherever he was in that moment, watching his lodge celebrate another new year. I hoped he was satisfied with what he saw. Hoped he felt that his dream was being honored, that people were finding joy in the place he'd created. The party continued into the early hours of the morning. I eventually went back to my room around 2 a.m., exhausted and slightly drunk. I hesitated before opening the door to 314, half expecting to find him sitting on the bed again. But the room was empty. Just my belongings, my unmade bed, the normal stillness of a hotel room in the middle of the night. I got ready for bed and climbed under the covers. And as I was drifting off to sleep, I thought I felt something, the slightest shift in the mattress, like someone had sat down on the edge of the bed, just for a moment, just long enough to check that everything was all right. I opened my eyes, but there was nothing there, just shadows and moonlight through the window. "Happy New Year," I whispered into the darkness. And maybe it was my imagination, or maybe it was the old timbers of the lodge settling, or maybe it was something else entirely. But I swear I heard a voice, warm and gentle, whisper back, "Happy New Year." I stayed at Cascade Peak for the rest of the week, and nothing else unusual happened. But I never forgot that encounter, never forgot the image of Robert Whitmore sitting on my bed in his outdated suit, smiling like he was welcoming me to his home. I've been back to the lodge twice since then, though never for New Year's Eve. Part of me wants to go back on December 31st, to see if he appears again, to maybe have a longer conversation with the ghost of a man who loved his creation so much he couldn't leave it behind. But another part of me is afraid of what that might mean, afraid that seeing him again might reveal something sadder, something more tragic about a spirit bound to a place by obsession or regret rather than love. So I stay away on New Year's Eve. I let Robert Whitmore check on his lodge in peace, let him walk his halls and visit his rooms and ensure that his dream continues. Because some hauntings aren't about terror or malevolence. Some are just about a man who built something beautiful and can't quite let it go, even in death, especially in death. I stayed in on New Year's Eve. I'd been dealing with depression for months, and the thought of forcing myself to be cheerful at some party felt impossible. My friends had invited me out, sent multiple texts trying to convince me to join them, but I'd declined them all. I just wanted to be alone in my apartment in Calgary, maybe watch some movies, probably fall asleep before midnight. I'd made myself dinner, nothing special, just pasta, and settled on the couch with my laptop. I had a queue of movies I'd been meaning to watch, comfort films that required no emotional investment. The apartment was quiet, except for the sound from my laptop speakers. I lived alone in a small one-bedroom on the 4th floor of an older building near downtown. The place was cheap, which was all I could afford on my salary, and the building had that worn-down feeling of a structure that had seen better decades. By 11:30, I was considering just going to bed. The movie I was watching wasn't holding my attention, and I was tired. I'd worked a full day, even though it was New Year's Eve, covering a shift for someone who'd wanted the day off. I was about to close my laptop when my phone rang. The sound startled me. It was 11:55 p.m. on New Year's Eve. Who would be calling me at this hour? I looked at the screen. Unknown number, no caller ID. I almost let it go to voicemail. I hated answering unknown numbers. Assumed it was always telemarketers or scammers. But something made me pick up. Maybe it was loneliness. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was something else entirely. Hello? Static. The kind of crackling, distorted sound you get from a bad connection or interference. I was about to hang up when I heard a voice, faint and distant, barely audible beneath the static. Is this? The voice said my name, my full name, first and last. Yes, I said, now more confused than annoyed. Who is this? More static. The voice came through again, clearer this time but still distant, like they were calling from very far away, or through some kind of barrier. I'm calling from the future, from 5 minutes from now. You need to leave your apartment, right now. I felt a chill run down my spine. This was a prank, it had to be. One of my friends trying to get me to come out, trying to scare me into leaving my apartment so I'd end up at their party. Who is this? I asked, my voice harder now. Is this Tom? This isn't funny. The voice grew more urgent, more desperate. The static faded slightly, and I could hear the fear in their tone, raw, genuine terror. There's no time. You have 3 minutes. Leave everything. Just go, please. You have to leave right now. This is a prank. I don't know who you are, but I'm you, the voice shouted through the static, and for the first time I heard it clearly. It was my voice. Exactly my voice. Same pitch, same inflection, but strained with panic. I'm calling from 5 minutes in the future. There's going to be an explosion, a gas leak. If you don't leave right now, you're going to die. We're all going to die. Please, just go. Then the line went dead. I stood there in my living room, phone in my hand, my heart pounding. This was insane. This was impossible. People don't call from the future. That's not how reality works. But something in that voice, the desperation, the absolute conviction, the terror made me move. I didn't question it. I didn't stop to think it through. I just grabbed my coat from the closet, shoved my feet into my shoes without tying the laces, and ran for the door. I didn't grab my wallet, didn't grab my keys, didn't grab anything except my phone, which was already in my hand. I just left, pulling the door shut behind me and running down the hallway toward the stairs. I didn't wait for the elevator. Some instinct told me to move fast, to put as much distance between myself and the building as possible. I hit the stairwell and started down, taking the steps 2 at a time. My shoes were loose, and I nearly tripped on the second-floor landing, catching myself on the railing. I kept going, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my mind racing. This was crazy. I was running out of my apartment because of a phone call from someone claiming to be me from the future. But I couldn't stop. I couldn't shake the terror in that voice, the absolute certainty that something terrible was about to happen. I burst through the ground floor exit and ran across the lobby, past the startled security guard who called after me. I pushed through the front doors and onto the street, the cold night air hitting me like a slap. I was wearing just a thin coat, no gloves, no hat, and the temperature was well below freezing. I kept running, down the block, away from the building. I didn't know where I was going. I just needed to be away, to be safe. I was maybe half a block away when I heard it. The explosion. It wasn't as loud as I'd expected, but it was unmistakable, a deep, rumbling boom that I felt in my chest as much as heard. I turned just in time to see flames erupt from the windows on the 4th floor of my building. My floor. Fire billowed out, black smoke rising into the night sky. Within seconds, more explosions followed. Gas feeding the flames, the fire spreading rapidly through the old building. I could hear screaming now, people running from the building, the security guard shouting into a phone. I stood there on the sidewalk, frozen, watching my building burn, watching the windows blow out, watching the flames consume the place I'd called home for 2 years, watching people flee into the street, some of them injured, some of them in their pajamas, all of them terrified. Fire trucks arrived within minutes, sirens wailing. The street filled with emergency vehicles, police cars, ambulances. They set up a perimeter, keeping people back as firefighters worked to control the blaze. I learned later that the explosion had been caused by a gas leak in the basement. Old infrastructure, poor maintenance, a slow accumulation of gas that had finally reached the ignition point. The explosion had torn through the building, triggering a fire that engulfed the entire structure within an hour. 14 people died. Residents who'd been unable to escape, who'd been sleeping or were too slow to react. 14 people, most of them on the upper floors, who'd been killed by the explosion or the fire or the smoke. I should have been one of them. I should have been in my apartment, watching movies on my laptop, completely unaware until the explosion hit. I should have died that night. But I got a phone call. A call from nowhere, from someone who claimed to be me calling from 5 minutes in the future. A call that saved my life. I tried to trace it the next day. I went through my phone's call history, pulled up the record of that incoming call at 11:55 p.m., but there was no number listed, just unknown caller and the timestamp. I called my phone provider, asked them to check their logs to find out where that call had come from. They told me there was no record of any incoming call to my number at that time. According to their system, my phone hadn't received any calls on New Year's Eve. But I'd answered it. I'd heard that voice, my voice warning me to leave. I had the call record on my phone as proof, except when I showed it to the technician at the phone store. They looked at it and frowned. They said the timestamp didn't make sense, that the format was wrong, that it looked like a glitch or corruption in my phone's memory. But I know what happened. I know I received that call. I know someone or something warned me to leave my apartment 3 minutes before it exploded. And I've spent every day since trying to understand what that means. If I could call myself from 5 minutes in the future, if some version of me that existed 5 minutes ahead in time could reach back and warn my past self, what does that say about the nature of time? About causality? About the universe we live in? I've read everything I can find about time, about physics, about theories of how time might work. Closed time-like curves, retrocausality, the block universe. I've tried to understand if what happened to me is theoretically possible, if there's any scientific framework that could explain it, but nothing quite fits. Because if I received a call from my future self, that creates a paradox. If future me warned past me to leave, then past me left and survived, which means future me also survived, which means future me never experienced the explosion, which means future me wouldn't have known to call and warn past me. It's a loop that doesn't close, a timeline that doesn't make sense. Unless there are multiple timelines. Unless the version of me that called was from a timeline where I didn't receive the call, where I stayed in my apartment and experienced the explosion in some way that allowed me to know what was about to happen and have the 3 minutes necessary to make a phone call before dying. Or unless I didn't call myself at all. Unless something else called me, something that exists outside of linear time, something that could see what was about to happen and had the power to intervene. I don't have answers. I just have questions and the memory of that phone call. That voice, my voice begging me to leave. I moved to a different city 6 months later. I couldn't stay in Calgary. Couldn't stand being reminded every day of the building that had burned, of the people who had died, of the inexplicable call that had saved me when it should have been impossible. But I carry it with me. Every New Year's Eve, at 11:55 p.m., I make sure my phone is charged and nearby. I don't know what I'm expecting. Maybe another call. Maybe a chance to be on the other side of that conversation, to be the one warning my past self. Or maybe I'm hoping to understand who really called me that night, whether it was me, or something pretending to be me, or something else entirely. Because if there are forces out there that can see the future and reach back to change the past, if there are beings that exist outside of time and can intervene in our lives at critical moments, what else are they doing? What other disasters are they preventing? What other lives are they saving? Or is it the opposite? What if that call wasn't about saving me specifically? What if it was about something I needed to do, something I needed to survive to accomplish? What if I'm alive for a reason, because there's something in my future that requires me to be here? I don't know. I may never know. All I have is the memory of that call, that impossible call from nowhere, from nothing, from a future that shouldn't have been able to reach back and touch the past. And the knowledge that somewhere in the fabric of reality, in the spaces between seconds and the folds of time, there are things happening that we don't understand, interventions we can't explain, voices calling out across time to warn us, to save us, to guide us toward futures we're meant to survive. I'm alive because I answered a phone call from nowhere, because I trusted a voice that claimed to be mine from 5 minutes in the future, because I ran without questioning, without hesitation. And every day since, I've wondered what else is possible, what other impossibilities might be real, what other voices might be calling out across